Welcome to the Local Cycling Club. My name is Chris Opie, and today I'm going to share with you some of the learnings that I found on my 300-mile bike ride last week. If you haven't seen that video already, it's on YouTube. It's on the Ride Stories page on the LCCC site. The idea being to commute back from London all the way to Cornwall. Unfortunately for me, it was a headwind. We knew this before we set off. It's quite an interesting ride. Head over there, watch the video, and then come back over here and find out what we learnt. 352 kilometres in, London to Cornwall by bike. Right, number one, as with all rides, the success lies in your preparation, getting ready before you head out on the ride. You can't just turn up for a ride like this without some prior thought and planning. So that's your fueling, making sure you're eating lots the day before. We're talking about a ride that was definitely going to take over 15 hours on the bike. It's the sort of ride that I very rarely do. I've only ever done something like this once before. So I knew it was going to be a real challenge. Having a healthy appreciation of what it is, almost a healthy fear, I think, really helps set you up for what you're going to find on that day. Having that slight level of anticipation, meaning that you're ever so slightly over prepared, so you're carrying more spares than necessary, you've eaten more the day before than you probably needed to, and then planning out your stops, your fueling and your nutrition on the day of the ride. So we woke up at 3:25, meaning there was just enough time to have a little bit of breakfast. Then I aimed to try and consume some food once every hour. I tried to eat bigger bites, more like you would do when you're at home, so having a more like a real meal in between the stops. And then when we got to the stops, having something savoury, because eating sweet food on a ride of that length can really get quite unpalatable, I think is fair to say. Everyone else is in the queue for coffee. I've devoured mine. I'm ready to go again. A further part of your preparation is making sure that you're planning a route. I'm not suggesting anyone else goes out and tries a 300-mile bike ride, but we're talking about rides that are slightly outside of your normal realms in your world of cycling. So if you normally ride maybe once a year for around 100 miles, if you're trying to add an extra 50 miles to that, this is the sort of ride that we're talking about. And rides like that, they really need that little bit of planning. So planning out a good route, making sure you know what the weather forecast is, so you're packing accordingly, wearing the correct amount of kit, things like this, they're really important. They're basics, but these are things that are really frequently forgotten. So making sure you have your tubes, your pumps, the correct amount of clothing should the weather change whilst on your ride. You'll notice on the ride, the weather did change for us, and we probably weren't as prepared as we could have been. It made it slightly less enjoyable, but probably added to the experience and to the story. Being prepared for eventualities like that will make it a much more pleasurable experience, because ultimately the most important thing is that you enjoy the ride. Sometimes when you head out and you're just focused on your destination, you kind of forget that the whole reason for riding was the enjoyment. Making sure you're prepared is a huge part of that.
Raining. I don't like the rain. It's not raining now, so hopefully it'll be okay.
If we start to break down the video, you'll notice there are a few key points which I feel are really important. And number one is being punctual. We agreed to leave at 4 o'clock. We were 7 minutes late leaving. Now, whilst that doesn't really matter too much, the whole reason for being on time is it affords you some sliding room. So if something goes wrong further into the ride, you know that because you left on time, you can afford to sort out those problems. As it was, leaving 7 minutes late, then being late at the coffee stop, stopping for longer than expected, things like this, it all starts to add up throughout the day. We stopped, I think, for a total of 6 times, which isn't much, but if you stop for 10 minutes longer than intended each of those times, that's an hour wasted. And when it's a 21-hour day, that's a lot of time. A little caffeine stop in Hungerford. I don't want to stop, I want to keep going. There's one key point which really needs reiterating when it comes to this ride, and that is that hydration is probably more important than fueling. It's quite well known that we could all survive without food for a period of time, but without water, we'd all perish pretty quickly. That becomes really important on a ride like this, because even when we're just breathing at a low intensity, we're expelling a lot of water vapor in our breath. Maintaining good hydration levels from the start is really important. Before we got to the first coffee stop, I'd already consumed both of my bottles, and then I had a 2-litre bottle up the back of my jersey, meaning that I could top my bottles up really quickly and have the drink at the cafe. So I was well hydrated. Lewis, we think, probably ran into some difficulties, partly because of hydration levels. So things like that are really important. Lewis is a very experienced cyclist, as am I, but it's still worth remembering that we all make mistakes sometimes. So for a big adventure like this, it's really important to make sure we get the basics right. That will just add to the enjoyment and the success of the ride. Lewis is having a difficult period, it's fair to say, Lewis, isn't it?
Knees.
The duration of a challenge is going to be different for everyone. For us, the whole idea was to get from the headquarters in London all the way back to Cornwall. That was going to be around 300 miles, give or take, depending on the exact route that we ended up taking and exactly where we decided to finish. It was guaranteed to be at least 16 hours of pedaling, but it could well have been more. Understanding the exact duration and then planning your stops based on that duration is going to be really important. Now, most of us have probably ridden for around 6 hours quite comfortably at some point in the past. If not 6 hours, perhaps we more regularly ride for an hour and a half to 2 hours. It's really important to know that when you're riding past that 6 hour mark, past the 8 hour mark and into the 12 hours and plus, it's a very different sensation on the bike. The intensity is really going to start to matter, and keeping control of that intensity throughout the ride. Really good pacing. I mentioned pacing quite a lot in these videos and how important the pacing is. It's more important than ever when the duration goes up. Making sure that whenever you're on a gradient, you're really controlling just how hard you're trying. And certainly in the start, in those first few hours when you're feeling good, you're probably a little bit excited, you're fresh, you're ready for the ride. Keeping the intensity down into that low zone 2, maybe even zone 1 for the majority of the ride is going to make it a lot easier. Paying attention to pace is already very important. You notice that you could squeeze on a little bit, but we've probably got over 15 hours of riding to go, and that's going to bite if you do. On to costs now, and this is quite an interesting one, I think. We learnt on that ride that it is cheaper as an individual to ride your bike back from London to Cornwall than it is to catch the train. There is one thing I'd mention though, and that's if I was to do it again, I think it would be quite entertaining to try and challenge myself further to keep the costs as low as possible, purely from an experiment point of view. And I say that because we didn't choose the cheapest of places to stop. We didn't plan our stops. We knew roughly where we wanted to stop, which villages, which towns, but the actual location of the places we went to, things like service stations, which are notoriously more expensive, we probably could have planned out a little better and chosen somewhere cheaper to stop, which would have made the ride much more affordable. I think you could probably ride from London to Cornwall for less than £20 or 23 euros, which I think is quite remarkable when you consider a train ticket is very rarely less than £75 these days. A lot of our coaching and training videos focus on performance, and never before have I realised just how important performance is to an ultra endurance ride or an endurance ride of any kind. All of the performance parameters that I spent my entire cycling career focused on for going fast over a very short distance became incredibly important once you extrapolate that out over 10, 12, 14, 16 hours as it was for us. That's aerodynamics, that's efficiency on the bike, that's maintaining a good cadence, riding in the correct power zone. Performance also includes the clothing that you're wearing. If you're wearing tight-fitting clothing, more aerodynamic clothing, that's going to be more efficient. Riding the bike in a relaxed fashion, so your muscles around your neck and your shoulders aren't fatiguing. You'll notice that I have the extension bars on my bike. This was probably my favourite adaptation to the bike that I made. It meant that I had a slightly different position, but ultimately, because the ride was into a headwind, it was more comfortable. Performance really matters when you're trying to go fast. It matters even more when you're trying to ride a long distance over a long period of time. Choosing the slowest stretch of road to do it.
It's alright, we're going to pretend it's slow motion.
Mindset. One of the most important aspects of cycling, full stop. It really applies when you're trying to push yourself past your previous limits. Throughout the ride, accepting that you're going to get tired because it's going to be very fatiguing at some point is one of the best places to start. You know it's going to be tiring, and that's partly why you're doing it. You're trying to understand what happens to your body, to your mind, as you start to fatigue. Approaching it with a really positive mindset, with a nice, healthy flow of energy throughout the ride. We were really fortunate to have a load of supporters join us. So we were joined by Gabe early on at 7 o'clock in the morning. We then had Nick, who joined us after 10. We were then joined in the men dips by Adi, and then by Dougie, and then by Felix and Finn towards the end. Having them bolster our ride and our support crew, as it were, on the road really made a positive effect on our energy levels, and it was a huge help. Little things like this along the way, so whether that's you can schedule to meet someone on a long ride with someone for a brief period of time, or just take your mind away from what it is you're actually doing, have conversation with someone when you stop. Things like this really make a huge difference to your mindset throughout the day. It's all about maintaining that positive flow of energy within your own mind. It's a great way to understand yourself personally. It would have been really easy on the ride when Lewis's knee started to hurt and when the rain started to fall to have felt that negative energy affect us. It drags you down ultimately. It's going to be very hard to fight against it. So embracing the difficulties and embracing the good bits of the ride are a great way to get more out of it. A very gradual gradient into a headwind, but we have some help, which is nice, courtesy of Gabe on the front with Alex. Earlier on in the video, I mentioned that it's really important to be punctual. With that said, I also think it's really important to be flexible. Ultimately, on a long ride that's lasting over 15 hours, you're going to have unforeseen issues arise, and you need to be flexible when they happen, because you need to adapt to those situations and you need to cope with them. If you're inflexible, you're going to be really worked up potentially, it will cause stress, and ultimately it will remove some of the enjoyment of the challenge. If things happen like punctures, the weather changes, somebody's suffering a little bit more than expected, or you need to stop that little bit more frequently, it's best just to accept it, be flexible, adapt to the situation at hand, and continue. A very relentless, nagging headwind. Ultimately, setting out on a long ride like this is a massive challenge, and the whole reason for doing it is to push yourself. So when you're pushing yourself, you need to expect things not to necessarily go to plan. It's not going to be easy, but when you get through it, you will have a massive sense of achievement. The chances are, if you've suffered throughout the ride, you're going to learn a lot about yourself, how you cope in those situations. And if the ride goes well, you're going to consolidate the learnings that you had beforehand. You're going to consolidate that preparation, and you'll know that that preparation really helped. It was a key to your success, and you should carry that into future events. I think it's really healthy to challenge yourself on a ride like this. I don't think you should do it too often. It's very, very hard. It's very fatiguing, and you're going to have to expect not to feel great on your bike for about a week afterwards. But once you're past that week, you'll probably feel more ready to start thinking about your next challenge. And then there were two. The only two that were destined to complete the ride. It was an amazing experience to ride from London back to Cornwall, and it was made all the better by those of you that came out to join us. So a huge thank you to Gabe, to Nick, to Adi, to Dougie, to Felix, and to Finn. Without your help, it would have been a lot harder and a lot less enjoyable. Lewis, thank you very much for the idea of doing the ride. The Ride Stories feature lives over on our website. I also need to say thank you to Alex, who lent me a huge amount of equipment for the ride, some of which you can still see on my bike now. And he also helped us in the first 180 kilometers to get to Bristol. What a great place to ride, nice and flat. Which brings to an end almost our time with Alex. If you haven't seen the video already, head over to our YouTube channel now and watch it along with all of our other videos, or find it on the Ride Features of the LCCC site. It's under the community function and it's in there. It's also a place you can submit your own ride stories, either via video, with photos, or just some text. Thank you very much for watching the video. Please do head over to the Ride Stories feature on the LCCC site, and I'll see you in another video soon.